Well, welcome to another Friday night. We're winding down our series on the prisons that come out of complex trauma, the things that were necessary survival coping patterns in childhood in order to survive the abuse or neglect, but what have become now in adult life big problems, causing issues in relationships, jobs, hurting others, hurting ourselves. And what happens for many people is they go to try to stop doing it, but something keeps drawing them back into repeating it. It becomes like a prison. And today I want to talk about the potential that happens for many with complex trauma is to begin to confuse sexuality as being love. And this is, to me, a talk that I've touched on 4 or 5 different times because sexuality is such a big component for many people in recovery that they need to think through, that they realize is unhealthy in their life. And so I want to come at it from a little different perspective today that I hope is really helpful. I want you to know up front a couple things. Number one, I want you to know that I'm not going to approach this in moralistic terms. What I've seen over the years is that for most people coming out of complex trauma, it affects their sexuality in negative ways. And for many people coming out of complex trauma, they're not even aware of that. But when they get to adult life, they begin to realize that they have some sexual behaviors that they realize are unhealthy, that are hurting themselves, that are hurting others. And they go to want to stop it, but something keeps. Every time they're triggered in certain ways, they just go back to those unhealthy sexual behaviors. So it's realizing the unhealthy sexual behaviors that come out of complex trauma that is our focus today. Now, what you begin to realize when you work in this field is that sexuality is a massive subject. And what they're realizing from research is sexuality affects almost every part of our life. So one of the things we see with complex trauma is it affects our brain, our immune system, our nervous system, our physical health. It just touches every part of what makes us human. What we're seeing with sexuality, it's almost just as powerful. It affects almost every part of what makes us human. It affects our nervous system, our body, our brain, our relationships, our regulation stress system, or it's involved in attachment. It's a somatic type of thing that affects the brain. It's just one of the core areas of major impact on our life, and we're extremely vulnerable because of it. And so it really merits our attention. And for many people, they don't realize that till adult life, and then it kind of demands their attention because it's starting to really do damage in their relationships. So I just want you to see up front that this sexuality is not something you can kind of put in a little compartment and say that doesn't affect anything, so I can look at it just in certain very narrow terms. No, sexuality impacts who we are in almost every area, and it makes us extremely vulnerable. So what I want you to see from today is what happens in early childhood with complex trauma is the child begins to think, or the brain begins to think, that sexuality is the way to meet many of their emotional needs. So the brain gets a little confused. So many of the emotional needs that the child has, if there's been sexual abuse, if there's been neglect, and now sex is used for self-soothing, they begin to think that the way to meet emotional needs is through sex. So now, today, every time that emotional need is triggered, the brain goes, let's go to sex. And now they have sexual behaviors that come out of multiple triggers that are connected to emotional needs. Now, Dr. Ruth Cohn says each one of us has a sex life, whether completely internal and wished for or actually lived in real time. So the key point is everybody has a sex life. Doesn't have to be just acted out sex. It could be a total internal fantasy world sex, but it's still a sex life. So we must take this as a given that everybody has a sex life. Some clients may have made their peace with whatever expression is or has been in their sex life, including asexuality. Some are totally okay with that. But others haven't made peace with this sex life that they have. And so they live with grief, they live with anger, they're mad about lost time or missed experience, or they live with a deep loneliness of skin hunger or touch, just longing to be touched, deprivation or body hatred. Many feel robbed, many feel cheated. I think that's so well said. Then she says this: beginning my journey towards sex therapy certification, I was surprised to learn just how wide the range is of sexual fantasy, sexual pleasure, and sexual behavior. I was much less sexually intelligent than I thought I was. In turn, I learned how narrow and arbitrary the window viewed as normal is. So our cultures developed kind of this window of what we consider normal sexual behavior. And what she began to realize is that that's quite narrow, and who made up those rules? It seems arbitrary. So although the media bombard us with sexual imagery and titillation, we continue to be hard-pressed to find and access reliable and useful sexuality information. The subject of sex still appears to be a point of shame or taboo or ignorance many of our clients struggle to understand. So there's tons of sexual images and sexual titillation in our media, but there's not clear talk about sex to help people understand sex. And so many of our clients really don't understand their sexuality very well, is the point. They wonder, what is wrong with me? And a lack of reliable reference to measure against, and nobody's safe to ask about sex. And so their brain goes to, well, it's just a natural drive, so it should be kind of automatic that you know what to do. Like in the movies, you should just automatically know what your partner likes and how to achieve that. And all the more when you're in a very self-reliant world, it's certainly anything but natural to think that one should need help in figuring out what normal is. So well said. So I want to go to kind of four major ways that the sexual drive in a child can get distorted or twisted. So the obvious one is sexual abuse. That does so much damage in a child. That distorts sexuality sometimes, and this is hard to say but important to say, sometimes almost irreparably. I have worked for many years in counseling people with sexual abuse, and sadly what I've seen with some is that they may never heal to the point of being able to engage in a healthy, intimate sexual relationship. There's just too much damage been done. Too many things get triggered today as soon as they go to engage in sex. It's just so sad. Others, they may finally eventually get to a more healthy sexual place and be able to have a healthy sexual relationship with somebody, but it could take years to get there. And so great patience is required. Tons of work is required. There's not a magic fix to just make it go away. The second thing, and we're going to develop this today, that really messes up sexuality is neglect. And most have never really considered that before. And so I really want to explain that as we go into our talk today. The third thing is to grow up in a family where one of your parents has unresolved issues around sex. So anything that is sexual in the child, the parent overreacts to. And that can do tremendous damage and really distort the sexual drive of the child. The fourth thing is parents or growing up in an environment that has very repressive teaching around sexuality, almost like puritanical. So some of you have grown up where it's been taught, or you just pick up that sexual desires, having sexual desires, that you're bad, that you're doing something wrong, that's a terrible thing to have sexual desires. Then some of you have heard kind of sex is dirty. It's an obligation. It's a necessity to have kids, but it's kind of a dirty thing. Some of you have grown up where it's the job of women to make men happy. So women should be willing to sacrifice all their needs and their desires and do whatever their husband wants, but it's all about the man. Some of you grew up where it was wrong to learn about sexuality, explore sexuality, experiment sexually, read about the subject in depth. That would be like you're indulging something really bad in you. Some of you grew up where you can enjoy sex a little bit, but don't enjoy it too much. That then would be having an idol in your life where you're kind of loving something more than God, and that would be a sin. That would be wrong. Some grew up within very patriarchal systems where women were accused of being at fault for causing sexual desires in men. So you're dressing too provocatively. You're acting in ways that are causing men to lust for women, so it's the woman's fault. So men didn't have to take ownership for their sexual desires. It was blamed on the women, and women therefore had to dress a certain way to not evoke sexual desires in men. Others in a patriarchal society where the men always were to initiate sex, the women just respond. And the women better respond positively if the man initiated it. So I could go on, but for many of you, you grew up with all kinds of teaching around sexuality that actually really messed you up when it came to developing your sexual drive in a healthy way. Now, it's been important in the research to begin to understand that people go through two times in their life, two periods in their life, where there's major development in the sexual area, which then affects the rest of themselves. So 4 to 6 year old that's kind of the first period where a child is in the discovering of their body. And so they're exploring their body. It's just innocent. They're finding out they have a penis, a vagina, all of those things. They're finding out that girls are different than guys. They play doctor. All of those things are there. What I want you to see is to that 4 to 6 year old, love is non-sexual. Love is just love. It has no sexual connotations for them. But if a child at 4 to 6 in this exploration stage is shamed for exploring, it does tremendous damage. If they are abused sexually at this stage, it can do tremendous damage. So this is a very vulnerable stage. The second one is puberty, and it's even more vulnerable. So the sex drive is awakening, the body is changing, sexual attraction is developing, and so all of a sudden there's pubic hair, there's growth, development, and they become self-conscious. They're extremely vulnerable at this time to being laughed at, to comparing themselves to others. Their whole identity becomes wrapped up in their sexuality. It's an extremely vulnerable time. So, with that as a background, let's move into what then happens to a child who goes through some way that behavior in their parents and their home that affects them sexually. So neglect, abuse, parents that overreact, bad teaching. So the first thing that can happen from sexual abuse, from neglect, is they go to hypersexual drive or no sexual drive. So the hypersexual drive, sexual abuse in that 4 to 6 year old age, that exploration stage, what can happen when you awake a drive too early is it becomes a hyperdrive. And so now the child can't get enough sex. Sex becomes a big part of everything that gives them pleasure, that lets them escape, that they want more of, to get more and more pleasure. So it becomes a hyperdrive. But also with that, what can happen for a child is if they're sexually abused at that age, something in their brain goes, I am getting validation. This is what I'm good at. This is what I have value in. My sexuality, my body, my looks. And so now their whole validation is based on those things, and they think that sex is a way to get the validation they need, to meet their validation need. And it gets distorted. And so they begin to pursue sex constantly because they're seeking the validation and being desirable. The flip side is they can go to asexuality. So they have zero interest in sex. So sex to them has been dirty, it's hurt them, it's disgusting, and so they just don't want it. And if they go to have sex, it triggers all kinds of flashbacks, or they just feel dirty, they feel tremendous amounts of guilt, and so they just don't want anything to do with sex. Some of these people often end up hating their body because they think their body's the culprit. It made others desire to sexually abuse them, so they hate their body. Some then begin overeating as a way to gain weight so that they're less desirable in their body. And so that then becomes an issue for many people that struggle with obesity. Something else that can happen, and it's a blend of the two, is for many people that come out of neglect or abuse, is they are attracted to somebody, but there's been shame that's developed. They don't feel good enough themselves. So when they go to start a relationship with somebody, they think the only way to attract this person and be desirable is to give lots of sex. And so in the beginning of the relationship, there's just constant sex. It's hyper sex. But then as soon as the relationship starts to grow and move towards deeper intimacy, they back away from sex. They don't want to go any further into intimacy. And so sex becomes less and less frequent, and in some cases, it becomes non-existent. And so it starts with hypersex, and it goes towards asexual. The next thing that can happen in severe sexual abuse or severe physical abuse is that the child develops dissociation as the necessary way of surviving. So they leave their body, they disconnect from their emotions, they disconnect from their body, and they live in their head, they live in a fantasy world, they live with constant distractions and busyness just so they don't feel. But they still have a desire to feel their body. And so sometimes what happens is sex today as an adult is the only way they can get in touch with their body. And so they periodically will have sex just as the only way to get in touch with their body. Another thing that happens with complex trauma is that the child grows up without parents to help them regulate their emotions. So the parents are dysregulated themselves, the parents are absent, the parents are angry, stressed out, and so the child has no healthy co-regulator for their emotions. And so they have to learn their own ways of self-soothing. And one of the things that they learn often as a way that is a self-soothing behavior is sex, masturbation. And so many begin to develop sexual behaviors younger in life because they provide a soothing effect. So they're meeting a need. So what I want you to see is what is happening in this child is sex begins to be seen as something that's going to meet multiple needs: validation, self-soothing, or regulation of emotions. Another thing that can happen for many children of neglect especially, but also of abuse, is they begin to realize, I can't trust anybody, nobody's going to be there for me, so I have to do everything myself. Therefore, when it comes to a developing sex drive, they feel a bit in a quandary because they masturbate, and that provides some pleasure, some release, some benefit sexually for them, but it doesn't satisfy as much as if they were to do it with a person. So they're stuck. They don't want to open themselves up to somebody. They don't want to trust other people and develop intimacy, but yet masturbation just doesn't totally cut it. And so they find themselves very torn inside. Another thing that comes out of neglect and abuse is the person becomes that self-reliant individual that puts up walls, wears masks, doesn't allow connection with other people. And so now when they go to actually have sex and they want an intimate relationship, it just feels so foreign, so uncomfortable. They just don't know what to do with it. So sex becomes a very uncomfortable piece for them. They want it. They want to do it well. They want intimacy, but they just are uncomfortable with closeness. Another thing that can happen for some is that if they had, let's say, a mother who was just very against sex, against closeness, so if you tried to hug her, she'd push you away. If you did anything or talked about sex, she'd always, that's repulsive. So she was just cold, frigid, negative about sex. And so what can happen for some people is that they actually seek out partners in adult life like that. Somebody who's going to kind of recreate the response to sex that their mother gave them. Another thing that can happen is that many love the sex, but they don't want the intimacy. That scares them to death. So they bounce from relationship to relationship, almost like a tornado, in this impulsive, compulsive sexual activity of hopping from partner to partner to try to gratify all their sexual desires without creating intimate relationships. So what I want you to see is that these people often are trying to balance two competing forces. And they're very powerful forces. So the one is, I want to gratify this sexual desire, and I want to get rid of the loneliness and have some type of relationship. But I don't want the intimacy because I might get hurt again. I don't want to get too involved in a relationship and then get abandoned again. And so how do I do a dance where I'm kind of getting my sex needs met, I'm getting some relationship stuff, but I'm not getting too close so that I'm going to lose the relationship? And that's what they're trying to balance as they go into their sexual world. Something else that some do is they go, I'm not even going to go to acting out my sexual needs with actual people that I could have a relationship with. I am going to do it with sex workers, by going to strip clubs, live sex performances. So intimacy for them and their sexual experience for them is more wrapped up in a fantasy world. Some, they go totally to a fantasy world, and now they don't even have sex with individuals ever. It's just porn and movies, and all of that is just feeds a fantasy sexual world. Some don't even go to any of that stuff, and they just live in this constant state of gnawing skin hunger and longing to be loved, longing to be touched, longing for somebody to want sexual intimacy with them that is pure and clean and full of love. that just leads to this haunting loneliness. Others just try to repress all of that and bury that, but it's still there. It's a haunting ache inside of them. Now, there's another thing that can happen for children that come out of trauma, and that is as they've dissociated, as they've kind of pushed down their emotions because they're only negative emotions, they've disconnected from feeling, is that life often then becomes very boring, very empty. There's just a dullness to life. And so one of the things that they do is they seek out experiences that are exciting, that will make them feel alive. And so one of the things that some people do is they use sex to try to feel alive. And sometimes that results in risky sexual behavior because that adds an extra shot of feeling alive. So again, they're trying to use it to meet another need, the emptiness, the deadness inside of them. Now let me take this to where this starts to get confused with love. So if you go in your thinking to a child who has a deep, deep longing to connect and to be loved, that is just the massive drive within every child. What happens though in complex trauma, they have this massive longing to be loved and this massive longing to connect, but they're not able to connect. So they now go into trying to adapt. They still long to be loved, but they now are afraid to connect because every time they've tried to connect, they've been hurt badly. So what they begin to realize is that sex gives them all the feelings of love, but lets them avoid intimacy. So they now feel desired. And that feels like love. So now for them, love and sex begin to be confused because as soon as there's sex, they feel desired and that feels like love. So what I want you to see is what is happening in the child who hasn't been able to connect and who isn't getting unconditional love is the wires in their brain begin to get crossed. The child begins to think that sex meets all my love needs. It gives me tenderness. It gives me nurturance. Somebody sees me. Somebody respects me. Somebody accepts me. Somebody validates me. Somebody becomes attuned to me. I have feelings of connection. I have pleasure. It medicates pain. Sex is meeting all my needs, especially my love needs. And so the brain then begins to cross its wires and think sex is love. And that is where the life trap begins to really take place. Now, there's other things that are happening in complex trauma. So they're not only seeing sex as meeting needs, but they're also beginning to see sex as the solution to some of the issues that come out of complex trauma. So what are the common issues that come out of complex trauma? Shame. I don't feel good enough. I don't feel lovable. But all of a sudden, somebody wants sex with me, I feel lovable. Okay, that just solved my shame issue. So sex is now the solution to my shame. Whenever I'm feeling shame, just go out and make sure somebody wants to have sex with me, and then I'm good. Another thing that can happen with that shame issue is I feel less than. I feel inferior to everybody else. And so what can happen, sadly, for some people is sex now becomes a way to feel superior. I take the lead. I take charge. I dominate the other person. For some, they actually can use sex to be a way to demean other people they just so dominate that other person. Another thing that comes out of complex trauma is just this longing for connection but don't know how to connect. And so now when I have sex, I have the feelings of connection. I go, oh, that just solved all my connection issues. And then another issue that comes out of complex trauma is that haunting fear, I'm going to be abandoned. And so every time I'm afraid I'm going to be abandoned, I better go have sex because then the person wants me and they're not going to abandon me. So now sex is not just seen as the solution to all my needs and my love needs. It's now seen as a solution to all of the issues that come out of complex trauma. Now I need to take this further, and this to me is such a significant piece to understand. So it's important to understand that there's two types of sex. So there's pure, just physical sex or animal sex or genital sex. It's just the physical stuff that happens that creates orgasm. But then there's attachment-based sex. And that is sex that takes place not just because physical stimulation, but because of emotional needs being met, because of pure, healthy connection and safety happening. That is the most satisfying type of sex. That is when sex gives the greatest pleasure. So what is necessary for attachment-based sex? So number one, it will only happen if both partners feel safe. Secondly, if they're capable of secure emotional attachment. And thirdly, both are in their parasympathetic nervous system. Then there's going to be healthy attachment-based sex. But let's go to a child from complex trauma. Well, all three of those conditions they're not capable of. They don't feel safe. They aren't able to securely attach, and they're in their sympathetic nervous system. So what is happening to a child growing up in complex trauma is the very three things necessary to learn the most satisfying form of sex. They're not in an environment where any of those three things are going to happen. So what then happens to that child? They get into their puberty years, they experience sex, but it's purely physical. They're in their sympathetic nervous system. They don't feel safe. They're not connecting, but they get the physical sensation. And so to their brain, that's all they've known, that's all they've experienced. So they think, okay, this is sex. So what do they focus on? I will become a professional in learning how to have the greatest physical genital sex in the world. I will learn every technique. I will study the physical organ and the physical act so that I get the greatest sex in the world. That's where their thinking goes. They have not been exposed to attachment-based sex, to understanding the psychological, emotional components of truly satisfying, meaningful sex. And so they, sadly, and this at times just breaks my heart, they are pursuing enhancing the physical aspects of sex, but are totally missing out on understanding the emotional attachment basis of sex. And so they will not experience truly, truly satisfying sex. And that happens for so many. Now, let me just very quickly cover, to summarize, what are some of the areas then that are affected by a child's sexuality? And so we started with this, and I just want to highlight a couple things. So number one, a child's sexuality has a profound effect on the shaping of a child's identity. So nothing intensifies the feelings of vulnerability in a child like sexual stuff. So how a person responds to a child in those key developmental stages has a profound effect on their identity. So a child then going into puberty, somebody laughs at them in the locker room about the size of their penis, about their pubic hair, about their slow development of breasts. That shatters them. That creates shame. That messes up their identity. It then produces tons of anxiety, tons of fear. A profound impact on identity. But then sex touches so many of our needs. When you look at our acceptance need, it's our whole personality, but it also includes our sexuality. And so how somebody responds to me sexually, that affects whether I feel accepted. It touches our abandonment issues. It touches our validation issues. It touches our guilt or false guilt issues. It's very much part of learning boundaries. I can say no. It's about learning autonomy, where I end, where you begin, what I can say no to, what I can allow for myself. It's very much connected to our trust issues. It's very much connected to our attachment connection issues. So sex is connected to basically every need. But when a child thinks that becomes a solution totally to meeting that need, that's where it goes wrong. Hopefully you're listening to this and going, okay, I see how my complex trauma has distorted some of my sexuality and resulted in some unhealthy approaches to sexuality. How do I heal? So begin by understanding the things from your childhood that distorted your sexual development. Be very clear about that. And then begin to define how those things did distort your sexuality. So look for patterns of behavior that developed, emotional patterns that developed, beliefs that developed about yourself, about sex, the needs that you tried to meet with sex, the issues that you tried to solve with sex. Just kind of map out how your sexuality developed and how it all interfaces with everything else. Then find somebody safe that you can begin to talk honestly about these issues without fear of being judged, without fear of them thinking you're a pervert or a sick person. Somebody that you can really begin to process this stuff. Then accept that even though you might be 40 or 50, you've never learned healthy sexuality. Now you need to learn it. And some people, when they realize that they're a late learner, that they're learning at 50 or 40 what they should have been learning in puberty, they get feeling shame. I'm stupid. I should have known this. No, don't go there. Or others get angry. I'm so mad that I wasn't taught this, and they just want to lash out. That anger's natural. Just don't feed into it too much, but acknowledge it. Some get very impatient. Well, I want to learn it all now. Just understand it's better late than never. Better to start now than not at all. This is where I'm at. I need to start learning healthy sexuality. And with that, learn the difference in your life between attachment-based sex and just purely physical animal sex. When you can begin to learn how to have emotional intimacy first, as part of sex, as the foreplay. And foreplay is not just a half hour before the sex, it's the whole week, 24/7, of learning to connect emotionally, providing safety. And so that means there's going to be growing trust, growing acceptance, growing openness, growing vulnerability, growing connection, and talking about deeper and deeper things. When you are really working on developing that, what you're going to begin to realize, it just enhances your sex life. Your sex becomes even more pleasurable. It's the cherry on top of the sundae. So with that, to me, this is so important. Learn to communicate regularly and openly with your partner about sex. What I have found for many couples is they can talk about everything except sex. It's the topic that just gets avoided. They expect the person to just kind of read their mind, to figure it out. Talk about it. There's no shame in that. Talk about your needs. Talk about your likes. Talk about your dislikes. Talk about frequency. Talk about things you would like to explore. Talk about your love language and things that help you emotionally to warm up and to feel connected. Have all of those conversations. Now, I just want to add as a little sidebar, don't be afraid to have times where you plan sex at a certain time of the week. Now, I think there's been a misunderstanding that many people think that spontaneous sex is the best sex. But for many from complex trauma, that's not true. Because what happens is they're afraid to express their needs, and so they walk around on pins and needles, hinting at sex, that they're interested, wanting sex, hoping their partner will offer sex, but they're afraid to say anything, and it just adds stress, it adds anxiety, then it adds anger when their sexual needs aren't being met and their partner's not responding. So if you can just say, let's go for a time where we just plan, we're going to have sex, we're going to work towards that, we're going to spend ourselves preparing for it, getting in the mood, it can actually help couples as they develop healthy sexual lives. Next thing is, in your own life, learn what healthy sexuality is for you and what unhealthy sexuality looks like for you. So for many people, there will be times when masturbation is actually a healthy thing. There's going to be times when masturbation is a very unhealthy thing. You need to know the difference. There are going to be times when you're looking forward to sex with your partner and you start to fantasize about having sex with your partner, and that can be very healthy. But there will be times when that can become unhealthy, and that can take you to very dangerous places in your mind. Then you're going to have to learn, when it comes to frequency, okay, I might have a greater sexual drive right now than my partner does, so I want it more often than they do. So do I just want them to give in and give themselves to me every time I want it, or do I need to learn some self-control so we find a balance that sometimes I do without, sometimes they make a sacrifice? I have to figure that out. The thing to really watch out for is you do not want a relationship where the sexual relationship is basically determined by what one partner wants. So you get somebody with a hypersexual drive that just wants it all the time and is mad if the partner doesn't constantly give it to them and doesn't constantly sacrifice for them. Or you get somebody from severe sexual abuse that just never wants it and expects the other partner to go without sex. So you want to find a balance, a way to meet both partners' sexual needs in a healthy way. And that is so tricky and so important to learn how to navigate well. Next thing I want you to be aware of is there are going to be times when sexual activity will trigger underlying issues. So it'll trigger shame. It'll trigger false guilt. It'll make you feel very vulnerable. It'll make you fear being rejected. So it's going to trigger a whole bunch of complex trauma issues. When that happens, don't get down on yourself, but be curious. Explore what's going on here. Where's that coming from? What happened in my childhood to cause me to have this trigger? Are there any lies that come out of this that I need to be aware of? That becomes the process of continued growth in this area. Is every time you're triggered, you begin to explore, learn new things, and then you grow a little bit more. So let me end by what for me is a very challenging scenario. And that is when you end up in a relationship with somebody who comes out of severe sexual abuse. I have worked with so many couples, and what typically happens is the person is severely sexual abused. Sex triggers them too much. They don't want sex. So the other partner ends up with this powerful sex drive, but every time they want to have sex, their partner gets mad. There's a big conflict, and so they have to do without sex. So Ruth Cohn talks about her early days as a sex therapist. And back in the early 90s, there was basically one book out on this topic, and it was by Wendy Maltz called The Sexual Healing Journey. And here's what Ruth Cohn says. That one lonely volume was practical and hands-on about things couples might try and do. However, the heart of its message was that the partner of the designated traumatized, in this case the sexually violated client, the one who had been sexually abused, that the partner needed to be patient and supportive, beyond saintly, a little therapist-like, In effect, they were to disappear or disavow their own pain and discomfort. In other words, they were to be patient with their partner, but basically stop having any sexual needs, any sexual desires. So they were to continue to endure, wait, figure out how to manage their own physical and emotional desire and frustration about the lack of sex. This approach was understandably wearing thin for these men, and for many that wildly understates it. It was torture. It was cruel. Meanwhile, the person who had been sexually abused, they felt guilty for saying no all the time. They felt pressured into giving in and having sex, which then re-traumatized them. And that sure didn't make them feel more desirous by them saying no, by them having so many issues. So it just starts creating even greater baggage between the couple. So while the partner somehow tolerated sexless, often completely touchless monogamy, and often for years, they both felt terribly stymied and often desperate. And it certainly did not help that no one seemed to be talking with them about the problem, about sex. Rather, the whole subject was sorely neglected. The survival of sexual trauma was designated as the problem child, while the partner was essentially sidelined, overlooked, taken for granted, and in effect neglected. This is, to me, such a huge issue for so many people coming out of complex trauma, that they end up with somebody with sexual abuse. They get into a relationship, they love each other, but the sexual relationship just causes so much problems. The other person just can't do it, and then that means this person has to give up their needs, and it causes so much pain and frustration and conflict and anger and resentment. Get help. Begin to work through so that you can both figure out how to help each other sexually, to meet your sexual needs, to heal and grow. So like I said, this is a massive topic. I hope what I've shared today helps you understand yourself better, helps you understand areas that you need to grow and improve to have an even better sexual life. Thank you for being here. It's the end of another Friday.